So I'm going to try and keep this to an hour. So kind of keep up with me if you can. But I also want to go through all the steps. So remember, just like absolutely anything else, before you start technique like this, or if you were doing parallax using left to right images and speed, you really got to kind of plan everything out before you go very far with it. And so for this, I wanted something that kind of panned along. So the Photoshop file I built is an extremely wide file and a pretty tall file. And it's kind of layered out. And this started out as only a couple of layers, and I got kind of carried away this afternoon a little bit. But basically, I set up all the layers that I want to have as a different layer. I mean, as a different plane within my parallax effect. So I've got my sky, which and a set of mountains, which actually I took my original image and I sort of cloned it and I merged them together. You can kind of see the seam there in the middle. Normally I'd give a little more care to that, but we've got our mountains. There's a row of trees with a lake sitting in front of it. We've got our guy sitting up on a hillside, sort of standing up there. And then I've got a couple of other layers in here, a bird that like I said, originally whenever I put this together, my thought was the bird would kind of fly through independently of everything else. And in case I wanted it, I found this picture of a peregrine falcon, I guess, sitting on a bunch of leaves, branches. But the thing about this is that whenever I set this up, I mean, my composition is only going to be 1920 by 1080. But if I want to do a pan across, like I'm doing here, or if I want to do like an extreme zoom, say like a rack focus or a zoom kind of thing, I'm going to want to make sure that I build my Photoshop file or my Illustrator file, whatever it is I'm creating, plenty big for the purpose. So this is with all its layers, this is a 500 meg file. I mean, it's like a little over 3,000 pixels tall. My composition is 1920 by 1080, But I've got a lot of resolution that I can use to do a lot of different things. So I wanted this to pan, so I made it nice and wide. All right? Like I said, pre-planning is really kind of the first thing. Second thing is, compositionally, this is the way I want it to be. And that's kind of an important thing to point out, because when I get into After Effects, a couple of things I'm going to show you, we're going to look at is using a goofy null to control the scaling and the placement of all of my images within space. It's a neat little trick. Nulls are useful for, I'm sure you've all looked at tutorials to do certain things and they wanted you to use nulls to align the points on a path, crap like that. But nulls have 1,000,001 uses in After Effects, half of which you can't even dream up until you need them. So, but it's got a couple of very kind of specific, neat kinds of uses. So, compositionally, it's where I want it to be. And it's put together for all the different planes that I want it to have. And that's my setup. So, this is a Photoshop file. You could do an Illustrator. You can do an illustration in Illustrator. Doesn't really matter. Whatever it is, you got to do some setup on it. So there's my setup in the file that I provided for you. And if I come over here and take a look at my After Effects file, it's a fairly simple kind of setup. And I'm going to do this from scratch, but it's all my layers. It's a camera. I've got an additional adjustment layer, and I worked a credit pre-comp into it. So compositionally, it's pretty simple overall. It's just what I'm going to do with it otherwise. All right. So I'm going to all right. So I'm going to start a new composition. I use the one I've got. So this would be scene 2. 1920 by 1080, 30 frames a second, and it's only 10 seconds long, is my composition. And I'm just using a transparent background just so I can make sure that I see everything. And remember, we can turn our black background on if we want to, but I was finding that it's harder to see stuff. So the first thing I want to do is, whenever I brought in my parallax file, I brought it in like we do all of our other ones. Bring it as a file, as a composition, retain layer sizes, and create a composition when it does it. So we've kind of done that a million times. I want to skip over that particular part. Or maybe I should. File. There's that Parallax PSD. Photoshop. Change that to composition, retain layer sizes, create composition, and open it. And let it merge its layer styles, which there aren't any in here, so it's a pretty safe kind of thing. All right. So I brought my Photoshop file in. I've got my 1920 by 1080 composition. The next thing to do is to go into this Parallax file. I'm going to open this up because all my layers are in here that I want. And before I do anything, the first thing what I know is that these are a lot bigger than I really need them to be. So I'm going to want to be able to scale them down when I get it into my other composition. But we know how whenever we scale anything in After Effects, it always scales off of the object's center point. So if we just bring these in and try to scale them, it's going to put all of our layer positions out of order, right? I mean, our center points are kind of all over the place. So it's going to make a little bit of a mess. So I can combat that problem, though. This is the first use of our nulls. So within this parallax comp, the one that's way too big, I'm actually going to go in here and layer new, add a null object, which is going to drop it right in the middle of the composition, which is kind of why I want to do it here. Controls where I put it. And then I'm going to grab all of my layers and parent them to that null. So that anywhere that null goes, all those layers go with it. Conversely, if I scale that null, what do you think is going to happen to all of my layers?
Will you scale with it?
They're going to scale with the null, which is going to keep every layer in the position we want it to be in. So I'm going to start by just grabbing I could scale these here. I'm going to scale them in the other composition though. So I'm just going to grab all of these objects, copy them, and then I'm going to go into my Scene 2 comp, and I'm just going to paste those in there. Grab my null, and I'm going to drag it up here. Whoop. Grab my null, drag it up here to the middle of my composition, and everything travels with it. And if I want to be really diligent about it, I'm also going to go into my Align panel, center that null horizontally and vertically, so that everything's kind of centered up the way I want it. And then if I open up my scale property on that null and scale this down, everything goes with it exactly the way I want it. So by setting up that null, parenting everything to it, I assured that whenever I scale it, position it, all of my layers are going to match the way they were in my Photoshop file. Once we have that, we don't need that null anymore. So now that we've got all of those different layers in there, we need to be able to, we've got them positioned X and Y, but we haven't done anything within our Z space. So I'm going to take all of those objects and all of them, yeah. I'm just going to turn those all into 3D layers. To start with. And then I'm going to add to my scene add a camera. And we did cameras before, one time before, but this time we're going to do something a little bit different. I want to use a 2-node camera this time before we use the 1-node. We're going to use a 2-node camera. And 35 millimeters should be fine, I think. We can try a different, I think if we do any other, if we do a smaller diameter lens, it's going to distort things probably too much. So we're going to use a 35 millimeter. And we want to make sure we enable depth of field. Once you got that, say OK. And then up here in my composition window, I'm going to go over here and change this to 2 views so that I have my camera view on the left and I've got my top view on the right. So taking a look at this, basically, and I mean, we've seen this before, so, but all of these layers here are sitting right here on top of each other in the middle. And here's our camera. If I select it, there are, I want to zoom in here. One of the things I want to point out about this camera, so like I said, this is a 2-node camera as opposed to a 1-node camera. And the second node, so the first node is the camera itself. The second node is actually kind of a, think of it as a focal point, if you will. And it's basically a anchor point that sits out here right at the view plane. And if you grab that and move it, the camera will follow that point. That's the difference between a 1-node camera and a 2-node camera. The reason I kind of point that out is that we might make use of that, we might not, but it does cause a couple, can cause a couple of goofy things as we're working, which I'll make sure happen and I point out. But we always want to remember we've got the second node in here. So, but that node allows us to do things very simply, to do like pan our camera nice and smooth, tilt. You know, if we move it, if we change to a front view, and we grab that, actually, I'll just go into my transform controls. It's called a point of interest. If I move that up and down, it'll tilt it. If I move it left and right, it'll pan. So, but we're going to use that whenever we set up our final composition here. So, what we need to do is now move all of our layers to different points in the Z space. So we work left, right, top and bottom, X and Y. Now we got to do, to go back to my top view, now we got to position things in the Z space because we want to be able to apply depth of field to them. So don't do what I'm going to do right now,
And
because I don't want to have to go back and undo it. But what I want to show you is, typically, and until I learned this trick, like not too long ago, actually, it's been pretty recent. The way to do this was always select your object and, like, let's grab my sky, for instance. And it's going to be the furthest object back in my plane. But whenever I move it away from the camera, what happens? It gets smaller, doesn't it? And then I've got to go in and I've got to scale it up. But again, I composed everything in Photoshop. And if I've got to go and move all these manually like this, I've got to go back and try to reposition all of this stuff, right? I got to get my scale up to about where I want it, move stuff around in roughly the same position. It gets tedious. And actually, most of the time, this is what you're going to do, for the most part. But for my scene that I've got here, there's another way to do it, and it uses a null again. Just like, really, very similarly to what we just did, but we got to do one other little trick. So I'm going to undo that, and here's what I'm going to do. So this camera has a position in space, and its center point, or its point of interest, is right here, square in the middle of our composition. So if I add another null to my scene, it's going to drop it right in the middle of my composition, which is cool. But, you remember how, so in order to scale everything, keep everything together the first time, we just kind of parented everything to that null and then scaled that null. Well, we want to do something that's kind of the same, except I got to turn this null into a 3D object. There we go. Except whenever I scale these objects, I want to scale them off the position of the camera. And you'll see when I do this why that is. But, so I'm actually going to take, you might just watch me do this first and then do it. So I'm going to take this null, and this time I'm just going to parent it to my camera directly. Whenever I do that, what it does is it picks up the coordinates of my camera. So if I open up my null, look at the position, you see that because it's a child of my camera's center point, the 0 position, is all the way back here. So when I place that, parent that, it gives its z dimension is 1800 pixels, 1800 and some odd pixels. What I want this null to do is to be back here at the camera, because then I'm going to parent all of my layers. I'm going to scale from here, and they're going to scale out in the z space. So with my null parented to my camera, I'm going to go in here to this position where it says 1866, and I'm going to type 0, hit return, and it moves my null back to where the camera is. So anytime you're working with a null, or anytime you're actually parenting objects together, the children pick up the coordinate structure of the parent. Suffice it to say, if you parent the null to the camera, go into the z dimension, and change it to 0, it'll put the null right where the camera is. And then, if I select all of my objects, except, I'm just going to do 5 of them. I'm not going to do this hawk layer because I'm going to leave it right here at my view plane for right now. I'm going to select all 5 of these and parent them to my null. Oh, I don't need my null to be a child of my camera anymore. I had to undo that. So if I grab all these, parent it to that null now. Now if I scale my null, remember these are all parented to it, so they're all going to go with it. I want to scale this up a little bit, and you see my objects there moving out. And because it's scaling off where the camera is, it's matching the view cone, and everything is looking like it's in exactly the same spot, except it's further out in the Z space. So it's moving them and scaling them at the same time. That makes sense? More or less?
So it can move like, well, we can't tell it's moving because it's not doing anything up the street.
We can tell,
Sorry, I'm just.
nope, we can tell over here. So we can see over here, because I need to be able to move all these layers in the Z space so that whenever I apply my depth of field, it affects the layers appropriately.
Okay. That's,
And by doing it this way, it not only scales it and moves it, but it keeps it looking exactly the same as it was in my Photoshop composition.
He says X here.
how is that go?
It's scaling to the camera and it's matching that view cone.
Do what?
That's the Y.
See.
Yep. No. Yeah, because it's an awful lot of stuff just to do for the hell of it.
He's sorry. And he been.
Exactly. There is a purpose to it. Yep. So we do that, and it's moved all of those objects out. So now it moved them all together. So now I'm going to take the first one, this bird, and I'm going to unparent it from my null so that it stays in this position. Now when I grab my null again and I scale it, I'm just scaling the remaining layers. And see, if I go back and grab the bird, here's my bird. I left it behind. So now I moved all these out. My foreground, I'm going to now unparent that. Go back to my scale.
Go back.
Do it again. When I stop my trees, I'm going to unparent those. Go back to my scale. There's my mountains. And then unparent those. Here's my sky.
Yeah.
Scale it. I got to keep zooming out because I'm going so far back in space. But anyway, so I put them all at different points in Z space this way, but I kept them proportional to what they were originally. And that's the trickiest part of the whole thing. Here's why we did it. So here's why everything's positioned out in space. Actually, delete my null. If I open my camera and let's see, open my camera options. I don't want to mess with my transform yet. Camera options, our depth of field is on. I can change my focal distance. So when I change my focal distance, watch my camera over here in the top view. So I'll change my focal distance. See this extra space, this little, that's the focal area. And I'm actually bringing it out kind of close to where my guy is on the mountain. And then if I go to my aperture, I can increase my blur level, but I find the results are a little bit better if I go to the aperture and I increase that by, it starts out as 17 pixels, but if I drag that up, see what starts happening with my composition? Starts getting a little blurry in the background. So I'm gonna go back to my one view, zoom in on it. Not what I wanted to do. There we go. So this is why we move everything in the Z space, so we can start to get our depth of field in here. And I can kind of tinker with the focal distance a little bit, narrow, maybe shorten that up. Maybe the aperture, I can make it a little smaller to make the blur not quite so extreme, or I can make it real extreme. And this part becomes just a little bit of kind of tinkering with it until you kind of get it in a way that you like it, like anything else. But if I go back to my two views here, and let's see, I want to scale this one down. Where's my, so there's my foreground. So if I, let's see. If I select my camera and kind of push it forward, why did everything go within? Don't be a bonehead now. Better. There we go. So if I push that through, you'll see that my camera's depth of field will pick up and give me some nice results. So if I pull back here closer to where the depth, where this focal plane is near this bird in front, he's now in focus. And as that focal plane passes through each of these objects, now my mountains are in focus. There my trees are, except my bird's in the way. Stupid bird. Let's get rid of that bird. There, so now my trees are in focus. But it took a flat, we've taken a flat image and we've given it depth. And remember that the purpose of mine was actually to pan from left to right. And I can come over here as far as I kind of want to. Actually, maybe I'll go from right to left. So, bless you. So if I take my camera, open him up, open my transform controls, I'm just going to grab my position and my point of interest in both and set keyframes for those at the beginning. And then, actually I only want this to last about 8 seconds, so I'm gonna pull my trim bar into 8 seconds. Pull my playhead over there, and I'm gonna slide my camera across to there. So now I get that kind of, because the cameras, everything's at a different point in space, you can kind of see how they move at a different speed the further back they go. And that's kind of that parallax effect. The further away from the camera an object gets, the slower it appears to go. And I'm gonna easy ease into my final keyframes. And actually, maybe as we move across, so like our bird's in focus here, maybe I'll pull my focal distance in so he is nice and sharp. Narrow my aperture down a little bit to help my background objects. So as I pan across, then by the time I get to him, I kind of want him to be in focus. So I want to, let's see. I want to set my focus distance, set a keyframe for that. When I get over here to this guy standing on the hill here, I want to pull my focal distance out. So if I just kind of play across here, I kind of rack my focus so that and I probably could have done this as, instead of panning left, or instead of dollying left to right, trucking, I guess, I maybe could have panned from one side to the other. Might have been a nice effect. But either way, it does do a nice job of giving us that motion, those different layers of motion. And I've done this too before, where I kind of didn't get as much motion as I wanted, so I cheat individual layers. It's like anything, you know, if you don't get exactly what you want, cheat it a little bit, you know? I mean, all your layers are editable, changeable. Do what you need to do to get the results you want. So is that, let's see. Look, got a nice focal distance there. So if you get that, once you pan that camera across, toss the type into it that I had in the original one. And do a type layer. Okay. All right, so from my example, two other things I had. One was the type. which I'll do in a minute. But my example actually had, if I jump back over to that,
It,
has kind of a dark vignette around the edges to kind of tie everything together.
You think that
So
on that and
the vignette's fairly easy. We've done the work for the, either way, we've done the work for the parallax portion. So anything additional we add here, like, you know, I added type to mine. If I just, like, maybe, like right about here, maybe.
yeah, I was good. We'll be done now. But honey. Probably that young we start then. But out in the reds.
they'll take it. You know,
We got them. Get going. Hardest to like building.
I'm just going to kind of set some text right there in the middle, kind of compose it a little bit. And when I get it where I want it, I'm just going to pre-compose it. So select on both of those, I'll pre-compose them. And this will be my AD credit. And then I can handle this any number of ways. I mean, I could animate this individually from everything else. So if I wanted to open that credit up, I could. Maybe animate these in some way. Or
Like, hey, good that. Hey, that.
make it a 3D object. Maybe I just do something right about here. Start that there. Transparency. Maybe 0. Position, set a keyframe.
Fuck. Move.
About here, or pull that out.
So I do.
it did a, yeah, I did go ship. I think it was.
It's risk and I
No,
did it. But hey, my man. Maybe. Yep. But maybe that's the and like
there,
and you know we're
you those things here, I got to know you want it. No, see,
the falling because those I told you something that
there's got to wrong with it.
yeah, girl, like even was out they bought the considerable to
They had things.
the lost the
Out.
steak last.
See, I picked up with Stina. But she died today.
So I'm not yeah, oh yeah, what's problem here. Try to get I'm the bottom of it now.
Explain, I'll get dressed.
I was you know I could tip this or start here but then I even know. There is the chill. Wait, so not on it. No country could not be need to go but you. So no that
Honestly,
yeah. So it could
So you can animate the type however you want. And then the last thing I had was that vignette. And I just put that in so that, and I used a adjustment layer for that. So I have new adjustment layer. Nice thing about an adjustment layer is you can place it on top of everything else, and if you've got multiple clips that sort of transition from one to another, you can lay the adjustment layer on top of it, and it'll affect across all of them. So I just did an adjustment layer. Got my effects and presets. I use Lumetri Color to do it. And it's got vignette as this bottom option.
But yeah, I think it go out. But sure, play bright start. Yeah, good. Yep, I think this. It makes most of the arts. I'm sad. You know. The whole God that are the put the Lord off the number by start control warriors. We judge people that can let me that is big. I looked it up and I studied all gone and go percent. And that but these in next day you other things ice and duffer that is with that. You know, to then I got bullet. That's it. This would be only something nothing. Well, spelling they the done. It's a you're thinking tapper and all you make me chill a bit. Yeah.
So that's our parallax effect.
Yeah.
One apple complete. That is
What are you funny?
how it in this figure. But Maple City is the big one. Big. Transmitted. They have. There. Of them. Listen.
Nothing.
Bye bye.
But
I'm good on she's still good. You think Stop the refluxer. It's this.
yeah.
Or it's nothing. They fight. It's Doshman sent built. All is up in that is dead.
She goes sick.
Any questions or anything I need to redo on that? We all got it? Let them do it? Yeah.
No, to goodness.
Boom.
The there's